Well, hello and welcome to our AHE Conference 2020. This is our third week and our second session, and we have a book launch for you today. I'd like to introduce my panelists to begin with. We have Arturo Hermann from the Statistics Authority in Rome. You might like to give a little wave, Arturo. And Professor Sheila Dao, who I believe you're currently in Canada, Sheila. Yes, so welcome to Sheila. And Andrew Mearman from Leeds. Hi. And we have Anders as a co-host. My name is Simon Moatt. I'm currently the coordinator for AHE, and I'm proud to be involved in this book launch, which is going to focus today on the theme of economic pluralism. But before we do that, just a couple of house rules. During the actual session, if you have any questions for any of the panelists about the book or about the discussion on economic pluralism, can you please put your question into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen? If you have any particular concerns about the operation of Zoom or any technical difficulties or any queries about the session at all, can you please put those into the chat, and the co-host Anders will be able to communicate with you directly on that. Okay, so the format for our session is, for the first 15 or 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be introducing the book, talking about the book themes, and a little bit about the rationale, and a little bit about the chapters that are contained in the book. We then are going to hear from Arturo Hermann, who is going to speak to us about how heterodoxy can, we hope, better address the imbalances of our day in terms of inequalities and environmental degradation, financial and economic crises, and unemployment, and so forth. And he will be discussing how our book seeks to highlight and showcase work that AHE members have conducted that will hopefully contribute to these issues through being able to offer more robust and effective theories for policy making processes. Following Arturo Hermann, we're then going to have a discussion which will have a few questions directed to a panel consisting of Sheila Dao and Andrew Mearman on the subject of economic pluralism in general. So I will begin by sharing my screen. So bear with me. Right. Can you all see my screen? Can the panelists perhaps let me know whether or not you can see my screen?
No, we can't.
Okay, so Anders, what's going on here? Bear with us while we sort this out. Ah, right, here we go. So I'm hoping that everyone can see the screen now.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. So here is our book, due out on October the 8th, this autumn, published by Routledge. And the title speaks about, hopefully, a fresh look, a contemporary look at what's going on in the world of heterodox economics, but specifically what implications do these issues have for the construction of theory and the ability to influence the policy process. So if we look down here at our book description, our particular proposition is that heterodox economics can provide a more complete and robust explanation of economic phenomena than is currently provided by orthodox neoclassical economics. This greater explanatory power, we hope, is therefore going to be more appropriate for policy formation to address the major crises of our time, and via the medium of a more pluralist approach to economic theory. Now, we contend that heterodoxy has always contained a measure of pluralist research. However, a key theme of our book is that we can do more, and that increased economic pluralism within the economic community, the heterodox economics community, will lead to better outcomes as far as policy is concerned. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to switch to a PowerPoint that I've provided, so bear with me. Great. Okay. And would you just put your thumb up if you can see the screen for me, please? Can you, Arturo, would you be able to, can you see the screen? Good, okay. So, there are three key themes that pervade the entire book. And the first one is really that we are, as I mentioned earlier, we are suggesting that heterodox economics is generally more pluralist than mainstream neoclassical approaches. But in addition to this, it also pays much greater attention to economic history, which is important for a range of reasons. Firstly, we can argue that a study of institutions or markets or phenomena are perhaps better understood when we can understand the historical processes that led to their existence. We argue that a more complete and robust explanation of economic realities makes heterodox research better placed to inform policy, and these can then address current economic, political and social imbalances of our time. Now, the second theme that pervades the book is the idea that heterodoxy from the outset has, in a sense, self-identified as an outsider to the policy-making process. And we suggest that this has happened either by design or perhaps unintended consequences of its research practice. So when the AHE was first formed, we see various researchers joining together with a common desire to challenge the mainstream neoclassical positions. And it was not so much that there was opposition to mainstream economists, but it was more that there was the sense of being excluded from their research activity and their research community. And one of the difficulties that we feel has derived from this particular origin, if you like, of our particular association and heterodoxy in general, is that this means that it almost presents itself as an outsider to the policy-making process. By outsider, I'm referring or have in mind the comment made by Yanis Varoufakis in his experience of working in European monetary policy forums. And he describes how if you're seen as someone that is critiquing from the sidelines, as it were, you're not seen as a person that is intrinsic or significant to the policy-making process. Whereas there is an expectancy that if you are an insider of a policy-making process, that whilst you might be expected at times to adopt collective responsibility and accept outcomes that are not specifically of your own choosing, there is at least an opportunity to be able to contribute or steer the actual policy-making process. So in this sense, we're kind of exploring the theme, is heterodoxy self-identifying itself by the other, i.e. neoclassical economics, and as a consequence of that, is it more difficult for heterodoxy to be able to influence policy? So that's our second theme. A third theme is on economic pluralism itself, and our proposition is that if we can improve our pluralist credentials, this will assist the heterodox community in gaining traction in the policy-making process, which could then lead to the betterment of humanity and its environment. How am I doing for time, co-chair? Okay. I think I've got about 5 minutes. So Marx and Keynes. So we know from the outset of the heterodox community in our association that there were groups of post-Keynesians and Marxists who found common ground, not necessarily in the theory or in the ontology, but they were finding common ground in the fact that they felt like outsiders. Yet, in terms of the policy-making process, Marx and Keynes were clearly very different. So Marx begins as a student and researcher in the realm of philosophy and becomes interested in political events around him. And then, even while he was at university studying his philosophy, he begins pamphleteering, and these political views expressed very soon caught the attention of the Prussian authorities. And I think in many ways, Marx's life perhaps would have turned out very differently had he been more accepted by the elites of Prussian society of his day. And I think we are told by biographers of Marx that he actually wanted to have a chair in a Prussian university. So in many ways, I think he'd seen his career trajectory as not someone that would be on the outside of policy-making processes and ignored by generations of policymakers into the future, but instead perhaps had aspired to be more influential in changing actual policy. Keynes, on the other hand, you know, a famous father, educated at Oxbridge, worked for the India office, very much in the centre, if you like, of the British ruling political class, and as a consequence understood its realpolitik, as it were, the German word referring to the sort of ebbs and flows of the political process. And Keynes was clearly much more aware of the political policy-making process itself. And as a consequence, we could perhaps consider him to have been more of an insider to the policy-making process. So what I'm suggesting here is that it could have just been the unintended consequence of Keynes's upbringing and nurture, as it were, and Marx's, if you like, more different events of his day that actually led to them being outside and or inside of the policy-making process. That said, of course, Keynes was very much outside of the classical way of thinking. It took a while before his personal ideas, of course, were taken up after and during the Great Depression, and when he was advising Roosevelt and so forth. But so not suggesting he was always influential, but he clearly understood the policy processes better through experience than Marx would have done. So my point is, to conclude on this, is that if heterodoxy is going to be more effective, somehow or other, it needs to be not considered as an outsider. So I'm just going to briefly describe the chapters that make up the book, and then I will pass over to Arturo. So we have a foreword, by the way, by Alan Freeman, who is a coordinator and an instigator of the early stages of the AHE, and he comments on the evolution of the AHE and from the outset and where it's going now. So chapter 1, Anders Eklund, these aren't the actual titles of the chapters, by the way, but I've just done this for simplicity. Anders looks at heterodoxy and tries to say, why is it different to the neoclassical, and effectively boils it down to dynamics and method rather than statics. He also, very interestingly, talks about the early stages of the formation of neoclassical economics as being rooted in physics envy, as he describes it, and many of the characters were looking to follow or to have the same scientific credentials as the physicists. However, that wasn't the way the physics academics saw these emerging economists at all. And interestingly enough, as I think will come out a little bit later, there are some parallels with the way we can actually consider pluralism to be slightly economic pluralism to be more of a perhaps physics approach than the neoclassical version of physics that they tried to emulate. Secondly, our second chapter, John Malberg, our membership secretary, he has produced a chapter discussing economics as history, and what he's trying to do is use the ideas of Michel Foucault, who the political economist theorist from France in the post-war period, a contemporary of Sartre, who had a lot to say about what he described as power narratives, and so John in this chapter discusses economics as it's discussed within these parameters of power narratives. Next is my paper, chapter 3, which looks at the Hegelian dialectic and seeks to suggest that as a meta theory to look at the trajectory of economic thought and to also form the basis of a economic criteria in a more normative economics approach, which seeks to be work on the concept or is ideally founded on the concept of inclusion. And I suggest in the paper that this is what Hegel and Marx's original intention was, to actually create an economics of inclusion. So that's kind of a philosophy paper. The fourth paper by Nick Potts and Phil Armstrong, they focus on the Keynesian economist Kalecki and Marx. And interestingly, they try to say that it's quite easy with seeking to create synthesis between different thinkers and schools of thought, that there are a lot of grounds for error. And so they give quite a good case study in their chapter, which illustrates where common ground can be found within heterodoxy between two schools of thought that might be seen to be incompatible. And so I think it's quite a good paper because it's a practical demonstration of the pluralist economics at work. Miriam Kennett, drawing on her experience of 20 years with the Green Economics Institute and seeking to influence policymakers, she basically is making a straightforward challenge to the heterodox community: get out of your silos. Seek to create a type of philosophy that is more holistic, more interdisciplinary, and more pluralist, and not being ashamed to be so. And I think one of the things this paper illustrates is that academics, maybe in the 20th century, were persuaded into certain academic disciplines and schools of thought, and maybe certain pluralist work or interdisciplinary work as well would be considered to be less rigorous, therefore holding less kudos and so forth. And so therefore any budding aspiring academic would probably be dissuaded from pursuing that type of research. Yet it's that very type of research, that more holistic understanding of things that only can come from pluralist thinking, that actually is the type of analysis that is needed for policymakers. And I think Miriam makes a good case for that in her chapter. Next, Ralph Dassler looks at a Marxian interpretation, the TSSI, and interestingly shows how it can be synthesized with the resource-based view, which is a contemporary management analysis tool. And what's interesting about this paper is that he's directly illustrating how Marxist thinking can better explain the very concepts that these management theories are trying to explain. So very useful paper. Then we have Arturo looks at what I call the P word, economic planning, and I will leave a comment on that until Arturo speaks. Next, we have a chapter that looks at central banking, or more specifically, monetary policy, and what are the links and transmission mechanisms between monetary policy and inequality in our time. Right, I'll try and speed up because of time. Our next chapter we have by John Harvey, a post-Keynesian economist from the US, who many in the AHE community will be familiar with. And he's focusing on the deficiency, really, that neoclassical economics has at explaining how financial systems actually operate, and perhaps best illustrated through the experience of the global financial crisis. Our next paper by two professors from Brazil, they are focusing on a revamp of development theory and dependency theory in particular, and they focus on the center and periphery countries, but they look at them in the context of global value chains. The next chapter, Andrew Purvey's a really interesting paper positing the idea of quite a radical public ownership of land, which then gets leased to businesses and for agriculture and so forth. He gives a really interesting case study from Singapore and Hong Kong, two countries where both whose governments effectively own all of the land and lease it out to businesses. The interesting approach here is, of course, it's a direct challenge, of course, to the concept of private property, a sacrosanct concept in our capitalist world, but yet to capitalist economic systems, yet with a very interesting case of public land ownership. So, and I think the policy implications of that, whilst radical, certainly are worth thinking about. Next, the paper by Wendy Seeley. I made a small contribution to this, but it's Wendy's paper on neocolonialism in the Caribbean, and a good description of the economic structures that exist in the Caribbean today. And she uses examples from the tourism sector, and she illustrates how exactly the same processes that existed through the colonial period and the slave trade, going back to the slave trade, and how little has changed. Really presenting quite an important voice from the global south. Next, we have Bruce Cronin. Now, Bruce has, along with Fred Lee, put together the Heterodox Economics Journal rankings, which unfortunately show a relatively poor showing for heterodox economists, which for some might dissuade them maybe from pursuing a career in heterodox economics, hopefully not. What Bruce does in this chapter is brings the rankings up to date and gives a reflection on some really important matters to do with peer review impact at this time. Next, James Juniper and others have created a really good case study looking at orthodox macroeconomic textbooks that have been written and published since the financial crisis. And I'm afraid to say their work reveals a shameful business as usual in terms of the descriptions of many economic phenomena. Again, we see a mainstream economics that isn't very pluralist, and a lot of work needs to be done. Next, we have Sheila Dao, who gives an updated view on pluralism and heterodox economics, drawing on her substantial work on this topic over the years. Finally, Jack Reardon, who's responsible for the Economic Pluralism Economics Education Journal. He's also written an article for us where he talks about how can we improve pluralism in economics education. So I hope that gives you a rough idea about what to expect in the book. So I would now like to pass over to Arturo. Okay. Arturo, you need to unmute yourself.
Share screen. Okay, that's fine. Okay, let's start. This is the title. Simon already explained very well all the issues. So, how can I go down? How can I go down? Ecco qua, perfect. So, in such presentation, we want to illustrate with this presentation derives from Simon and mine introduction. We try to illustrate in a very synthetic way how heterodox economics can provide a more complete and robust explanation of economic imbalances than orthodox economics in theory and policy action. So it's important to note there has been some comment on this. There has been a general introduction to the main themes of the book. It doesn't convey a specific theory, but tries to highlight the diversity, the richness of contribution of the major fields of heterodox economics, in particular Marxist, post-Keynesian environmentalism, in explaining these imbalances. So let's start from microeconomic imbalances, which convey, as just said, a whole range of theories. So, as we know, orthodox analysis chiefly rests on the postulate of neoclassical economics. There are various versions of these theories, such as partial or general equilibrium models, but the basic postulates remain the same. Economic agents are or can easily become rational, and hence tend to maximize their utility function. Markets are or can easily become perfect and self-equilibrating mechanisms. So, if things stand like this, of course, the best policy is not to interfere with this wonderful mechanism, especially by the state that is deemed a scale or corrupt in this activity. However, the notion of a rational agent acting in a perfect market can exist only in an imaginary world based on static market aesthetics and exogenous conceived motivation of economic agents. In real economy, characterized by growing complexity of actual human motivation and economic action, these neoclassical postulates become increasingly realistic. They are realistic from the start, but they become, of course, more and more, and only with limited public use. So, another aspect, because in this analysis we are trying to bring together various aspects. So, even a methodological aspect, which is really important. So, the weak aspect of neoclassical economics is not so much to its simplistic hypothesis, but some can work simplistic hypothesis, but to the sequences, these hypotheses are kind of metaphysics, is a kind of wishful thinking, because they don't allow for pluralism, because they don't leave room for any real verification. So, a classical example, if available data show that consumer buy an item at its lowest price, then the hypothesis of a rational consumer is or seem confirmed. If, however, the data reveal, as it is in the majority of cases, different story, this would not put in doubt that theory, because the phenomenon would simply be ascribed to exceptional or exogenous factors. So, in other words, the prime postulates of orthodox analysis are not subject to any methodological challenge, and remain the same in the light of new data. So, in this way, econometrics, especially bad econometrics, is the best friends of Elio of orthodox economics. So, this part explains why orthodox economics is usually based on the construction of mathematical models accompanied by an elaborate proof of quantitative economics for the so-called validation. So, as I just said, what makes this methodological approach convincing is the fact that it doesn't allow the consideration of alternative explanatory frameworks based on the qualitative interpretation of a complex phenomena. So, another important example Neoclassical general equilibrium model is based on the idea of perfect flexibility of prices, including labor conditions. And, for example, would ascribe unemployment to the rigidity of this factor. Of course, this aspect can parallel a more flexibility than in some cases, but this picture is completely out of reality because it should also be considered as extensively analyzed by many post-Keynesian institutional economic contributions. Prices embody complex social relations, and therefore some kind of stickiness is necessary for ensuring the stability of the system. So, so-called sticky prices doesn't just is a signal of so-called market imperfection. It helps to maintain a stability, the stability of prices. Because if every price were wildly flexible, no social life would be possible. So, relatedly, the reason for unemployment can be mainly found in structural factors widely investigated by heterodox economics, in particular the Marxist reserve army of labor, the structural tendency of effective demand to lag behind the supply of full employment, the complex role of technological problem, the phenomenon of association for many products. So we have tried to convey more comprehensive interdisciplinary explanation of this phenomenon by discussing also the following dynamic aspect: the multiplicity of factors explaining scale economy, technological, organizational, financial, with all the market powers, shall we tell, the endogenous nature of a consumer preferences and firm strategy, which implies that these actions are determined by the complexity of human motivation in their collective and context-specific interaction, rather than by an abstract principle of utility or profit maximization. So all these aspects are receiving a much better and complete explanation by the various fields of heterodox economics. So there have been over time many contributions which have investigated this aspect, belonging to Marxists, neo-Marxists, post-Keynesians, institutional economics. So because an important aspect is stressed by the original institutional economics, its markets and the related notion of competition are not exogenous mechanism or maximize mechanism, but institutions created, maintained, defined by laws and institutions which have a strict, a tight relation with the policy action. Because if markets are set by institutions, they are set by with a kind of purpose. There is also a complex issue of social value. I have no time to deal with all these aspects, but this is a central aspect of this expansion, which is and is a central aspect also for investigating the human action and motivations. So all the issue of the maximizing over economicus, the rationality. So institutional economics, post-Keynesian economics, also considered in interdisciplinary realms with relation with psychology and psychoanalysis, can give a much more complex picture. The problem of these contributions, they are very interesting, but sometimes they are piecemeal, fragmented, sometimes they are in rivalry between each other. So there is a kind of rivalry instead of trying to set up a dialogue. Another aspect, for instance, another aspect stressed by this contribution post-Keynesian institutionalists is a trade-off between static and dynamic efficiency, so-called. For instance, in many sectors, it can be convenient in terms of scale economy and hence lower cost for product to have one or few large firms than the multitude of small firms. This is what is issue widely investigated by original institutional economics. So the useless duplication of firms. So the real problem that arises the issue of reducing the monopolistic power and give other point of voice to their stakeholders. So, also in this aspect, the heterodox-oriented approach by better identification of where resources of market power scale economies can help to frame industrial competition policy better and thus facilitate efficiency, sustainability sector at firm level. This aspect already just hinted to related to the investment policy, the role of interdisciplinary orientation, typical of heterodoxy, illuminating this aspect. So this is a point which not only heterodox economists make a radical critique of Arturo, but proposes new alternative framework. Does, for instance, the Homo economics seek to maximize money solely for material reasons? But one can well think and suspect that the quest for money, even if we meet somewhere money maximizer in the street, also cover, for instance, the partial unconscious need to be accepted by following the social approved behavior. So, do I want to maximize money as a primary reason, or because I perceive that it's a kind of social accepted and contingent historical evolutionary determined behavior? So, this kind of analysis would shift attention for the all-important role of attribute to profit to the ways to enliven animal spirit. They may tend to make initiative not strictly related to economic motive. This was a central intuition made by Keynes, which anyway resonates with Thorstein Veblen instinct of workmanship anyway. So to carry out initiative, social initiative, not just really to profit. And this is another big issue, because there is a tendency to say profits are necessary to finance investment, so to provide motivation to entrepreneurs. This is completely false. So investment are financed, we are going to see by credit creation, not by profits. And motivations, we see many firms, we are just are able to survive. Many people put initiatives not related to economic, to so-called economic motive. This is a really important aspect. So now we switched. So what we common themes try to bring together: microeconomic and macroeconomic imbalances. So we have said that the ideology of general equilibrium model. So also in this respect, also various neo-Keynesian models are in effect neoclassical models with rigidities. So because the underlying ideas informing these models is that if markets for crucial labor were perfectly flexible enough, involuntary employment would disappear. This is the point. But in this respect, various trends of heterodox economics, institutionalism, post-Keynesian, Marxism, environmentalism, stress a number of structural factors that render economic imbalances endemic. One is that prices are sticky for a number of structural reasons, including the necessity to ensure stability to social relations attached to economic motive. If every price for goods and for labor were quite flexible, if we have just seen, no, social level would be possible. So all the question of sticky prices and so yes, of course, but this should be made more in a more heterodox way, of course. Another aspect, very important in macroeconomics, is that prices are sticky also for another reason, because in general, price elasticity for a number of economic and social reasons there is a low elasticity. So it's just unprofitable for firms to reduce price. Prices are not widely flexible because it's not convenient for firms to follow such path. Yeah, it's just, let's look at our experience. If we did 1 at 2 kilos or oranges for a given period, it is rather unlikely that we will buy the double amount if the price halves. For the same reason, it becomes even more unlikely that the reduction of a price of, say, 90% would induce to buy 9 times more the initial quantity demanded. So this is a fundamental aspect of how economic system works. It explains the rigidity of prices. So,
wrap up, Arturo.
How many minutes?
Well, 2 or 3.
Okay, one more. Okay. Another relevant feature of the difference between orthodox and heterodox to the appraisal of public spending. Because in orthodox analysis, public spending is considered always a rigorous residual suboptimal. So the related principle is laissez-faire. Now, it's totally unrealistic. In fact, the reduction of public spending is rarely replaced by a corresponding increase of private spending. So, because the analysis of the economy shows that it is not full employment, but structural underemployment in economic resources. That is standard for capitalist economy. So, the coordinate effect just doesn't work. Because another aspect, public spending not only provides public goods useful for research and knowledge and material infrastructure, but last but not least, it constitutes relevant and most often irreversible means for maintaining effective demand. This is the principal reason explaining why the ratio of public spending or GDP has constantly increased over time. And the circumstance that austerity policy have only reduced effective demand and worsened the structural imbalance over this. So, this aspect constitutes a significant separation of the circumstance that we were only talking about the public credit, but what about the private credit on GDP? It's a constant increase over the last decade, ranging in the OECD country between 150% to 400% over the GDP, with the peaks in most important countries, because it was a way to make up for austerity policies, because the credit creation generates new demand and new income and thus contribute to form a saving rather than the other way around. So, in the dynamics of modern economy, therefore, the role of monetary policy influencing the real interest rate and orientation of the banking system toward credit creation can hardly be exaggerated. Just another tool. Hence, money function is far from neutral, since it plays a central role in creating effective demand. So, in this connection, the heterodox post-Keynesian concept of endogenous money suggests that there is virtually unlimited credit available for the private sector at a given interest rate. Such availability doesn't work, as Keynes said, the horse will drink, especially when effective demand expectations are low. But with believe that heterodox perspective was a much better explanation of the function, you would say, in private sector in modern capitalist economy. So all these aspects can help illuminate the measure this aspect, the growing disparity of income and wealth, environmental degradation, employment issues, regularity of economic and financial crisis. So in this respect, these have led to more effective policy action. This respect another interesting area of analysis, developed in particular by regional institutions, pertain to the identification of very forms of economic plan. Corporate, which is the reality of the modern economies, there is no free market, but corporate planning. Totalitarian, which can work in some cases, but can be authoritarian self, of course, and so it's then inefficient, self-referencing, and democratic, and in highlighting the best potential of democratic planning and addressing the major economic problem of our day. So the running theme is to bring together all these important theories, post-Keynesian, Marxist, institutionalist, environmentalist, trying to build a bridge between them, overcoming fragmentation. So, because after all, they are going to explain the same phenomena, and then try to maintaining the diversity to use their synergies to frame a better policies for solving the major imbalances of our time. So this is our message. So heterodox economics has a strong potential in this respect for framing better policy action. Thank you. I think I'm finished. Okay. Okay, finish.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arturo, and giving us all food for thought, much more broader consideration of matters than we can normally expect from neoclassical economics. Thank you very much. Sheila and Andrew, would you be able to put your screens on? Great, thank you, welcome. I've got a few, as you know in advance, I've got a few indicative questions, but please feel free to pursue, lines of thinking and points that you want to make as if you were giving a talk. The only reason to have indicative questions is to sort of hopefully steer some of the conversation towards the themes of the book, but please feel free to spend time labouring on something you would like to. So Sheila, can I begin with you? And also, actually, Andrew, sorry, can you give us a description, please, of economic pluralism?
Simple. If I may go first, Andrew. Sorry, I jumped in. A simple definition of pluralism is diversity, respect for diversity, and encouragement of diversity. But having said that, there are different meanings. So I'd like to just explore the different senses in which the term is used, because I think there's a fair amount of confusion around that. I mean, the main use of the term applies to methodological pluralism, which is diversity of approach. And the pluralism as opposed to plurality refers to the idea that, as has been discussed already, that our knowledge is strengthened by having multiple approaches, but also that respect for other approaches means engaging in debate and also being open to absorbing ideas from other approaches, as just been discussed, between different schools of thought. One of the important confusions about the meaning of the term at the moment is between methodological pluralism and theoretical pluralism, because there's a lot of discussion about whether orthodox economics is pluralist. And, people point to all the different developments within orthodox economics, which are indeed, fragmenting it away from a pure focus on general equilibrium theory. But it's open for debate, but I would argue that this is theoretical pluralism within one approach. In other words, it's not methodological pluralism. So, for example, terms are used in the same ways. The structure of argument ultimately is held in common. Beyond that, there's pluralism of method, which is to draw on a range of methods, and that involves being open to different disciplines and their different uses of method. And normally a particular approach within economics would find one range of methods particularly suited to dealing with the problems as they see it. Which brings me to the final form of pluralism, which doesn't tend to be discussed as such, but I think is really important because actually it underpins everything else, and that is ontological pluralism. Not just that the real world is complex and open and really needs a range of approaches to help us build knowledge about it, but because everything stems from real experience, and real experience is diverse. And it's so obvious just now. I mean, the diversity of experience between the global north, the global south, diversity in terms of race, gender, economic power in various contexts. And that's really where we're all beginning. That's what's motivating us to be economists and to...
Something, Sheila, when you talked about methodological pluralism, I suppose you're referring to a typical AHE conference with lots of different papers from different heterodox economists from different schools of thought. But when you're thinking of pluralist method, you're thinking of more synthesis of method. So someone taking a Keynesian conception of something and mixing and putting it into a Marxian model, for example.
Well, I was thinking more in terms of method in the sense of formal mathematical modelling or sort of more informal methods, different types of evidence and so on. The business of taking ideas from different schools of thought is a complex one for pluralism. The way I see it, if you take an idea from another school of thought and put it into your own perspective, you're changing it, which is fine. I mean, this is how we work, and you know how economics has worked over the centuries. That ideas are absorbed, picked up, perhaps with different meanings, but creating new useful developments in theory. But I don't see the, well, I mean, this is a huge area for debate within heterodox economics. I think it's difficult to think of the whole lot being synthesized into one heterodoxy, which starts from the same ontology, the same theory of knowledge, the same collection of theories. I mean, that strikes me as problematic, but certainly not exchanging ideas, justifying your own ideas, borrowing from elsewhere, and, you know, presenting this collection of ways of thinking to policymakers.
Thank you. Did you want to say something on that question, Andrew?
Just to stress, I suppose, a couple of things that Sheila's said. One being, I mean, we could call it fallibilism, I suppose, the idea that you recognise that you could be wrong, and in some cases fundamentally wrong. And that, now, this is not something that any of us do very well, but that would be an element of being pluralist, being open-minded. And when I talk to people who identify as heterodox economists, one of the things that they find most problematic about the discipline is this feeling that some people don't admit that they could ever be wrong, fundamentally wrong about what they're doing. Now, you know, whether heterodox economists are also guilty of that is a question that we could also discuss. But anyway, that fallibilism is an important element, I think. And I think the other thing that, and Sheila's written on this in terms of something she's called structured pluralism, but you know what pluralism is not is eclecticism, that you can just throw anything in, because obviously at some point when you're trying to combine ideas or think about ideas, there are things that just clash and can't really be reconciled, or at least not in their existing form. They can be moved beyond, sublated, if you like, but they can't necessarily just be reconciled or combined problematically. And that's so there, you know, there are limits to this. And I suppose one of the interesting questions from heterodox economists, which is kind of turning around the debate onto them, is, you know, to what extent is there a role for mainstream economics in combining with their ideas? And I think, you know, you could ask 100 heterodox economists and they'd give you 100 different answers to that question. So I'm trying to be provocative, but I don't know whether I'm succeeding. Anyway, I think that sort of, you know, where are the limits to pluralism is a very important question.
Mm.
So yeah, I'll leave it there.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you, Andrew. Because I think you use the phrase "anything goes," don't you, Sheila, to refer to that?
Oh,
yeah.
No, it's been thrown at me so often. No, I mean, this is a sort of big problem with arguing for pluralism with somebody who thinks that it's possible to demonstrate that one way of doing economics is the best, and therefore there's nothing to be discussed.
Mm.
I mean, the whole point of pluralism is that everything is up for discussion. As Andrew says, because of the nature of our subject matter, we can never demonstrate that one approach is better than another, or one theory is true and others are completely false. It's a matter for critical in the sort of logical sense, argument and debate and justification, and that's how we all get stronger. We build better arguments, better theory, better understanding, hopefully.
I think those comments from both of you are really interesting, and very much, I think, how we feel we want to proceed in terms of creating forums for that diversity of thought. And I liked what Andrew said about the idea of never being too sure to be not challenged, and presumably it becomes more difficult the deeper we go into our careers and the construction of our theories. Okay, thank you for that. I'd like to move now, if I may, to the topic of how can economic pluralism actually be beneficial. So I don't know who would like to start on that topic, but to focus on the real value that we can obtain from pluralist practice.
Do you want to start, Andrew?
You're muted, Andrew.
I was happy for. I was just reading Miriam's question, which I don't know whether that prompted your question, Simon. But Miriam,
I haven't seen it. I'll just pop on.
What's the point of pluralism when we're facing extinction and we know mainstream economics doesn't work very well? So, Sheila, what do you think about
that? Yeah.
Well, in what sense is an extinction being used? Is it for heterodox economics or the planet?
Or the planet.
The planet, right.
Well, our species and others as
yes, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, if not now, when? The issues are so pressing just now. And heterodox economics is so well set up to provide answers because we're all geared to addressing real problems which arise externally, not dealing with internal problems. And, you know, the more we can bring to the table from different perspectives, the better the solutions that we're going to find. I mean, there's an illustration of pluralism actually in terms of the scientific contributions to the current crisis. I mean, for example, the modelling approach and the public health approach are totally different. And what's been shown is that each can make a contribution, but on its own, it's insufficient. You know, and the people coming at it come from very different perspectives, very different methodologies. But for policymakers to be able to draw on both is clearly very beneficial. And I mean, the same argument applies to the economics, applied to ecological issues as much as anything else.
Yeah, no, I think just to query Miriam's question a bit, you know, it's just sort of suggesting that we're wasting our time if we're just by arguing for pluralism. Maybe that's not what she says, but I'm going to read that into it. And I think that's, you know, I don't think pluralism is the reason we're in the mess that we're in. The reason we're in the mess we're in is partly because there hasn't been enough. That there has been this imposition of a particular view, and that driving that on. And, you know, not just the imposition of a view of a particular way of doing things, without question, that has driven us to where we are now. So I think some pluralism might have helped us stop and get where we are, but and you know, there's nothing to lose by doing it now. And you know, where we are in a situation where this is how debate goes on. We're in a sort of democratic system where people have the right to share things. Oh, okay. Yes, okay, well, good. Then we agree, Miriam, that's fine. Just responding to Miriam's comment there. She's,
I'd like to make one response as well, if I may briefly, Andrew, which I think ties in to something I think Sheila's mentioned before, that obviously you can't have a continual bun fight and expect to produce effective policy. However, if you have pluralism in your practice, if you have that openness to that, which Andrew, you've described and Sheila have described, surely when you do arrive at some theory that can be used in the policy process, you're going to have more confidence in it.
Yes, it's and part of the process is that knowing that nothing is fully demonstrable, you have to be able to provide really good arguments for it and be able to explain why you think it's a better approach than alternative approaches. And if I could just introduce a further thought, I mean, in terms of how we got to where we are just now, it's really only in the last few decades that economics has really solidified the idea, or mainstream economics has solidified the idea that it's a technical subject that's value-free. And that's been terribly powerful. And it allows them to dismiss other approaches which accept that economics is a moral science, that it's not purely a technical subject. So, I mean, there needs to be argument on that level as well to make it clear that we're talking about values, for example, as well as you know, methods.
Yes, and that would be traditionally called normative economics. Maybe.
It's something that policymakers do. You know, you hand them the model and they plug in some values and off they go. Not like that. So, I mean, I believe in pluralist strategies as much as anything else, actually. And one of the strategies is to really go for that argument that economics is purely technical and really sort of show it up.
Yes.
And again, I think the current situation is illustrating that beautifully.
Yes.
And I think, just to follow up on that, I mean, Miriam's asked me to clarify that she doesn't think what I just said. So I just want to say that she's very much supportive of more pluralism and more heterodoxy, but actually that we need to be confident in saying what we can do and what we can offer to people. And I think that's right. And I think there is evidence of that, where heterodox economists do get the ear of policymakers. They're often very willing to listen, because they approach things in a more open way. There's no attempt to sort of cut out the social or the ethical. There's an attempt to think about things in more of a systemic way. And I don't just mean in terms of a mathematical model as a system. I mean thinking about the system as a real thing. And I think when policymakers see that and listen to those ideas, they are open to that, and they are prepared to incorporate these ideas in their work. I mean, there's an example of a colleagues at Leeds, Andrew Brown and others, who've worked on evaluation of infrastructure. And what they've applied is something called systems of provision approach, which again takes this takes the view of the world as a system and connected systems. And it is essentially looking at the entire supply chain and system of provision of things in the world. And it allows you to give a much broader understanding of any particular phenomenon. And this is clearly what's needed for the valuation of infrastructure or many other things. And it goes much further than the traditional sort of narrow approach that tends to dominate. So where heterodox economists get the opportunity to talk to policymakers, they find it persuasive. So I do think there's definitely scope for doing things and being confident, as Miriam urged us to be.
That's really helpful, Andrew. And I think in a couple of questions' time, I think we might steer ourselves towards looking at how we can achieve that better. But since we've had an earlier question from Miriam, I think it's only fair to bring in the questions from Jamie and John that we have. If you'd like to make a brief response. So John has asked, what do we make of Jeff Hodgson's recent claims that the heterodox movement should be viewed as a failure?
Don't agree.
Or didn't you use the phrase losers from the outset, Andrew?
Yeah, just something that we talked about yesterday, isn't it? In the book that I and Daniela Guizzo and Sebastian Berger just published, and Sheila is an interviewee, one of the interviews, Edward Fulbrook, says that he hates the label heterodox because he thinks it's a label for losers and it's people they've just given up. You know, it goes back to your point about whether calling yourself an outsider, whether you label yourself as an outsider. So I think, you know, I can see why people would think that. I mean, I think Jeff Hodgson's argument is interesting, and I mean, I think he partly wants to argue that heterodoxy has gone in a direction that he doesn't like, and doesn't contain enough. I think, you know, including that is not contain enough diversity. So is there enough institutionalism? Is there enough a role for behavioural economics? These kinds of things. And he's saying, well, where have these things gone in heterodoxy that it tends to be dominated by post-Keynesians and Marxians? And then he makes the argument that it's essentially a left-wing project. And I think that's tied in with other arguments that he's been making on wider politics as well. I think, you know, is it a failure? I mean, it's not a failure of its own making. I think one of the reasons we're arguing for pluralism is that there's a politics and there's a power dynamics within the discipline, and that arguing for pluralism is necessary. That ideas are getting squashed not because they're bad, but because they're just not favoured for other reasons. So I think to dismiss it as a failure completely is a bit strong. It's a provocative argument. It's interesting and it gives us things to think about. But no, I wouldn't accept that yet.
And it depends how you define heterodox economics. I mean, I don't understand why institutionalism wouldn't be part of heterodox economics, or neo-Austrian economics for that matter. I mean, in a way you could say that dominated the advice that Margaret Thatcher was using in the 80s. So, I mean, in a way, Jeff Hodgson is implying that he is other than heterodox. So, I mean, in a way, that argument's a bit beside the point. On the outside of it, I mean, there is a bit of an opportunity. Well, I mean, there are all sorts of opportunities at the moment, but in the mainstream, people are beginning to talk about power within the discipline. I mean, it's in a pretty limited way, but it is there. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the top 5 journals, you know, which it doesn't go very far as in relation to the way that we tend to discuss these things, but it is happening. And also there's a shift to applied work in orthodox economics, which, I mean, some heterodox economists have said to me that this allows much more scope for discussion than when everything was much more clearly tied to general equilibrium theory. And then there's the fact that the situation has called for governments to adopt what are really policy agendas that we would recognise from within the heterodox community. So I think there are little windows there through which we can promote this idea of pluralism and more directly sort of inject policy suggestions.
Yes, thank you. Sheila, would you be able to comment on Keynes's Babylonian approach? Because I think that would be quite an interesting area of discussion to pursue.
Well, the term Babylonian sort of emerged in economics in the 80s. It came from Charles Feynman's discussion of Babylonian mathematics and his contrast between that and sort of Euclidean mathematics. So I developed the idea of a Babylonian mode of thought to try and capture the way in which we really mostly subconsciously develop arguments and form a view as to what's a good argument, what's a bad argument, what's an argument that merits listening to, and what doesn't. And the Babylonian approach is contrasted with the Cartesian Euclidean approach, which is really a closed system approach, which is atomistic. It starts from small units axioms with respect to these small units, deductive logic, and a dualistic frame, either variables in the system or it's outside the system, and so on. Whereas a Babylonian approach is much more problem-oriented. So it connects with what I was saying before, that you know, it starts from a real problem and figures out the best way to address that problem. And it may require multiple strands of reasoning with different starting points. I mean, it's like Keynes explains how the money supply is created endogenously in one place, but says, okay, for this other purpose, we'll take it as given. I mean, that's an example of a Babylonian approach. And, you know, you can use different methods for different lines of reasoning. And if I can just say one more thing about this, given what you're saying about anything goes, a Cartesian Euclidean approach, or closed system approach, is dualistic. You've either got your preferred system or you've got nothing. Anything goes. And obviously that's not something that is terribly appealing. Whereas the Babylonian approach is an open systems approach, and within an open system, you can't have a completely open system, anything goes. In order to say anything useful, you have to sort of narrow it down to something manageable, and that's where you get your schools of thought and different chains of reasoning. So it's not a dual there, it's not Cartesian, Euclidean, Babylonian, it's Cartesian, Euclidean, and a whole range of Babylonians.
Thank you. And maybe, I mean, I might have misunderstood it, and maybe you can help me out here, but in my thinking, it seemed in the way you described it in your article that there's more scope for imagination and intuition. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking that with Einstein, for example, he sort of famously had a sort of sense of something, an intuition, and then he set out to prove it. So rather than a hypothesis based on rational axioms and thinking things through and then setting out to see if the evidence supports the hypothesis, there's almost an approach where he had a feeling and then set out to provide the objectivity.
Yeah, that's sort of generally what mathematicians say they do. And Shackle famously said that he got his best ideas doing the washing up.
Yeah. So is there room for that in economics, Sheila?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Keynes's discussion, treatise and probability of how we form beliefs as a basis for action involves multiple strands of reasoning, and it includes intuition. That pure reason is never going to justify action, because if we live in an open system, we can never calculate risk. There's always going to be uncertainty, so we can never justify action in that sort of strict sense. So the best thing to do is draw on multiple strands of reasoning.
Yes. Thank you, Sheila. This might be a good time to bring in Jamie's question, actually, where he talks, I quote, "An economy is a thermodynamic set of processes with waste and entropy. Scale and intensity matter. Measuring this ought to be foundational to economics. Pluralism might recognize this, but the point is not plural, it's primary." So how do you think that is, and which perhaps in a way, maybe Andrew might want to comment on this, but if you've got a science and there's something that needs to be done, should not economics simply be squeezing itself into that and addressing that directly? Any thoughts?
I mean, I think when people try to just think in terms of energy flows or carbon, or you end up in the same problem that you do with using a single measure of value as a utility or money or whatever, and that you're trying to capture a multidimensional object with a single measure, and that's the problem. I mean, I agree that okay, if we can't be plural, we can't be uncertain forever. We are uncertain, but we can't be hesitant forever. We have to act, and we have to decide we believe this more than we believe this. So yes, if we take the view that the world is like that, and it's essentially a thermodynamic system driven by that, yes, we do have to take that as a foundational idea. We should have to remain open to the idea that we're wrong, but we should have to work on that, take that as a foundational idea. I suppose the question for the economists is how far they grapple with that particular question, and how much they can say about that. This sort of points more towards interdisciplinary work. That, you know, but you have to be open to thinking about those dimensions, and that's another part of being pluralist. I think another part of being open-minded, that to take that sort of take what Sheila was talking about, open systems approach, thinking about the world in that way allows you to think about some of these dimensions that you otherwise perhaps wouldn't if your normal way of thinking was to close them off. So I think the interesting question for the economist is how does one deal with that thermodynamic dimension, which you're not really directly theorizing yourself. You have to take it as read. Clearly, it places different constraints on the system than if you just assume there was no problem. The system could just grow forever. Entropy makes things different. Entropy places constraints on, and that therefore has implications for the nature of the economy as well. So it is foundational. It doesn't stop the world being complex. It doesn't stop the world being, at a social level, contested and contestable and messy. So there's still a role for pluralism in different ways at that level. I think we're talking partly here about levels of abstraction and what we can, as economists, can focus on, what we can't.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, thanks for that, Andrew. A kind of a related question I have, which may be for Sheila, which is, so would heterodoxy influence policy more if it was more pluralist, or less?
I mean, heterodoxy is already pluralist. I mean, in a way, it's becoming more pluralist, but there is an argument being made by some people that it would be better if it was the basis for an alternative, you know, to take over as the dominant paradigm. But the fact is that within heterodoxy, there are fundamental differences about the way in which we understand the world, the way in which we think it best to theorize about it and to use methods. As pluralists, we discuss it, we debate it fiercely. I mean, that's, pluralists ought to debate fiercely. That's what it's all about. But I don't see the scope for it all being sort of blended into one.
I mean, presumably, policy makers have a particular ontology, or they have a particular way of thinking.
Yeah.
And so presumably, whoever are the researchers that are going to be contributing to that process need to presumably have an ontology that's consistent.
I mean, inevitably, governments do choose their advisors as people who think in the same way. I mean, that's natural. But on the other hand, politicians operate within a plurality in terms of the nature of the real world, and not least in terms of the electorate. So they have to pay attention to different experiences and different points of view. I mean, an effective government machine would recognise the benefits of pluralism and seek out advice from economists with different perspectives. You're often ending up with the same kind of policy proposal, which adds weight to that proposal in Keynesian terms, in a sense, and makes it much more appealing. But where there are differences, I mean, governments really need to know where the weaknesses lie. So the problem isn't, I mean, it's like Andrew was saying earlier, in a way the problem's not for heterodox economists. The problem lies in mainstream economics presenting itself as the most scientific way of contributing to the discussion. And it's really addressing that that's the sort of stumbling block for us, I think.
Yes. And because interestingly, we had Dominic Cummings, didn't we, in Britain, in the British political system, seeking to bypass some of the more traditional forms of research work, or putting out a call for that. So you know, maybe that's a sign that it's needed, perhaps at times. Yeah, what about diversity in terms of race and gender? Very much in our cultural consciousness at the moment with Black Lives Matter. Do you think diversity can contribute to the heterodox community's robustness and therefore its policy applicability?
No, absolutely. I mean, if we're trying to address reality as it is, reality is diverse, and we need to be able to generate theories and policies which address the problems that arise.
I'm coincidentally reading a really great book called Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez, and it's fascinating. It's notionally about data gaps and saying, well, you know, the data, obviously data that are collected by governments are their choices, and somebody makes a choice about what data to collect and what not to, and that these data choices are usually made by men, middle class, in Britain and other places, middle class white men like me, and I don't get to make the decisions, but and that necessarily biases the type of data that's collected, and therefore that necessarily biases the type of decisions that are made. And so and she presents a number of case studies in which that's changed, where they introduce, she's particularly talking about women, they introduce a gendered aspect to the decision making and the data collection, and it changes the policy. So I think you can obviously extend that to class and to race and various other dimensions. And if you're trying to come up with a policy which is better informed by evidence and also more likely to meet the needs of a diverse population, having a diverse bunch of policymakers is likely to make that happen. Obviously, it would be naive to say that that's necessarily going to change everything. There's still power here, and the overarching power relations push policy in a particular direction. So there are limits to the ability to influence that, at least in the short term. But certainly, yeah, and that argument then also applies to heterodox perspectives. If we just look at one object or process from a particular perspective, then we're going to think about it in a particular way, and then there'll only be a certain set of implications that are possible from that. If we bring in another perspective, that at least open us up to the possibility that there's another set of outcomes, and that will give us a more informed policy. Obviously, at some point, the policymakers have to make a decision and do something they can't be considering, but at least open it up to some extent to give them a better informed and also slightly more cautious approach, where they have to use their judgment and rather than being gung-ho, as we sometimes see. So I think, yes, in short, diversity, morally a good thing, obviously, politically a good thing, and certainly in terms of creating better knowledge and better policy prescriptions, I think it's also a good thing.
Great. We've sort of run out of time, but I'd like to give you both, a minute or two to give your final thoughts on the discussion. But just before we do that, there is one question that we haven't read out, and which is, why is it that heterodox economics is not very accepting of RCT, which I'm not familiar with this model and how it works, but maybe you might be able to comment.
Randomized controlled trials. I don't think heterodox economists are opposed to them per se, but the way they're constructed and the way they're used, they do kind of typify many of the problems that the heterodox economists identify when they critique mainstream economics. They assume a particular ontology. They assume a particular relationship between intervention and outcomes. They often engage in certain, sometimes dubious ethical practices. They're not very good at providing explanations. They tend to just test theories, so they're much more instrumentalist. So there are all kinds of ways in which RCTs go against what heterodox economists think are good principles for thinking about economics. The other problem as well is that RCTs are often used to impose policies which are pretty unjust and reflect existing power relations that heterodox economists would normally object to. So they wouldn't reject them out of hand, but they've got some pretty strong reasons not to like them that much.
So please submit a paper on RCT and come and join with us for friendly conversation. Would you like a couple of minutes each to sum up your thoughts on economic pluralism, Andrew and Sheila?
My last thought was going to be to answer that question, so I'm done. Thank you.
The last word, Sheila.
I like the focus that you put right at the beginning on the question of heterodox economics being presented as outside the norm. I think that's a very useful focus for us to think looking forward, that as pluralists, there is no sense of one approach being superior to others in any absolute sense, even if sociologically and in terms of power relations, one has put itself in a superior position, that we stand alongside and are perfectly legitimately criticising other approaches, particularly the mainstream approach, and therefore we should have confidence to present our ideas as ones which really have bite in the current circumstances.
Thank you very much. And just to conclude our session, I would like to thank our panelists very much for taking part. Sheila Dao, who's gotten up very early in the morning in Canada to be with us. Andrew Mearman from Leeds, and Arturo Hermann from Rome. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you, attendees. I cannot see you, but I have a sense that you're there because it says on the bottom of my screen there are participants. Thank you very much for coming. Please consider, if you're not a member of the AHE, please consider joining us. We have a £30 subscription to become an associate each year, and £10 for the unwaged. So please consider joining us and taking up membership. So with that, I would just like to conclude and say thank you very much. What a really interesting and really fruitful discussion. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Andy. Okay. Bye, Simon. Ciao.
Bye, Arturo.
Thanks to participants. Okay. Goodbye to all.
Bye-bye, Sheila. Bye, Andrew. And bye-bye, attendees.
Goodbye. Happy evening.
Bye-bye.
Happy evening. Okay. Goodbye.